Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, and friends. Welcome to a new episode of the GDM Show, the Global Dawah Movement Show. We're back today with Brother Hamza. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you?
Good to see you, bro.
Excellent. So, last week we did episode 1 of why you can't claim scientific miracles in the Quran. And what we showed was that if you claim scientific miracles in the Quran, you undermine the Quran itself.
Not only do you undermine the Quran, but you undermine science because
yes.
you're assuming that science is static and it's never going to change.
Yes. So, that was one of the points basically, right? So, maybe you want to touch upon them quickly before we move on.
Yeah, the first point was that you can't use science to prove the Quran because science is changing.
Right.
Okay? If you go into the philosophy of science on any level, to any academic, you will see that science is not supposed to be static. There are no Moses tablets.
Right.
If you look at the works of Elliot Sober, Alex Rosenberg, Stathis Psilos, Goch and others, you see that science is changing because we're always going to have a future observation that may undermine previous conclusions,
Right. Yeah.
which was based on previous limited observations. If you look into induction, the problem of induction, you look into empiricism, we see that they have a scope, that they're limited, that you can always maybe have a future observation that's going to deny previous conclusions. So, science is beautiful. It's supposed to change. It's supposed to evolve from that perspective, right? So how can you use a transient method, a time-bound method, to basically justify something that we consider to be timeless?
Yes.
It just doesn't work. It's a methodological inconsistency here. And this is why every time you say that there is a miracle in the Quran, a scientific miracle in the Quran, and you say that this is the science and this is the meaning from the Quran, then you've done two things, two assumptions that you've basically assumed. One, that this science is never going to change. And two, that this is the meaning that was intended by Allah, right? This was the meaning intended by Allah.
And that's the only meaning.
And that's the only meaning. Can you prove these two things? Not necessarily, because many of the words describing natural phenomena are not really explained by anything else other than going into the Arabic language itself, which has many layers of meaning. How do you know that is the particular meaning that was intended by Allah?
Sure.
And also, when you look at the science, can you really say this science is a fact and will never change? You can't.
Right, yeah.
You can't, because the beauty of science is that you can have future observations that deny previous
So that
conclusions.
was number one. The other was that...
The other one was that they claim that the Prophet ﷺ could have never have accessed other civilizations to have access knowledge that was scientifically crude, but true. That's not true.
Yes.
Because the Prophet ﷺ, as established by his own sunnah, by his own way, you could find this in the prophetic traditions in Sahih Muslim, that he looked into the Persians and Romans to see if he could basically allow his companions to cohabit with the wives that were breastfeeding.
Yes.
And he found it was okay for the Persians and Romans, therefore he concluded it's okay for his companions. So therefore you can't claim that he didn't have access to other civilizations with regards to their knowledge, scientific and medical. The other assertion that we made was that you can't say that the verses in the Quran that talk about natural phenomena in a way that no one else spoke about. That's not correct either, because many of the verses that talk about natural phenomena relate to knowledge that was existing previous to the Quran. For example, the Greeks, the Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians. For example, there's a so-called miracle claim that iron was sent down from heaven.
Yes.
Because Allah says iron was sent down. That's true scientifically. In some meteorites you have iron ore. From that perspective, it was sent down. But is it miraculous? No, because you had the ancient Egyptians, I believe 1200 years before the revelation of the Quran, that called iron Ba-en Pet, which means iron from heaven.
Yes.
So we gave many examples in Sumerian literature, in Greek philosophy and thinking, and in the Egyptians, to show that information was already available. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean the Quran borrowed. It doesn't mean the Quran is not true. We're not saying that. We're just saying that you cannot make the claim that it's a Quran, that it's a scientific miracle.
Okay, good. So, I mean, if they want more detail, you brothers, sisters, and guys watching can go to the first episode.
Yes.
And they can watch it. We'll put a link in the description box. Moving on swiftly, I've got a few questions for you today, and it's to do with the new approach.
Yes.
Right? It's a multi-layered approach to the Quran that we're offering instead of these miracles, and it's far more profound in many ways.
It is profound. It allows people to basically do tadabbur on the Quran, to ponder upon the Quran. Yes, it doesn't give you like, here's a miracle. It's not like fireworks and angels coming down, but it actually is is more warm in a way. It allows you to really have a relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to really ponder upon its verses. Because Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, do they not reflect upon the Qur'an, or are there locks on their hearts? So from this perspective, the more pondering we do, the more our hearts may become unlocked to receive the mercy and guidance of Allah. Now, this is not only the multi-layered approach, it's called the multi-leveled approach as well. So what does the multi-layered and multi-leveled approach mean? Very simple. The Quran uses a word for a description of a particular natural phenomenon.
Yep.
Okay? That word has many layers of meaning, because we know the Arabic language is rich. It doesn't have an infinite number of meanings, but it has a scope, according to the classical dictionaries as preserved in the early centuries of Islam. So you have many layers of meaning. Each layer of meaning addresses different levels of understanding over time.
Right. Okay.
This is very profound. So the Quran uses a word with many layers of meaning, and each layer of meaning addresses different levels of understanding over time, which is more in line with what the Quran is supposed to do. Because the whole raison d'etre, the reason for existence, if you like, for many of these verses concerning natural phenomena, are there to make you think about the fact that Allah deserves to be worshipped, that there's wisdom in the universe. If you look at the classical exegesis, be scholarly about this. Not many of the tafsir, the exegetical works, actually spoke about scientific miracles or nuances. Many of them said that's not the job of the verses.
Yes.
The job of the verses is to make you, for you to do your own reflection, to conclude that Allah deserves to be worshipped and there's wisdom in the universe. Not that there's something very specific about the kind of words that are used and correlating it with the scientific findings. No, because science changes over time. It's there just to act as a signpost, a
Right.
signpost to divine wisdom, a signpost to the worship of the divine.
So okay, that's excellent. Now, that's a very powerful claim. Now, give us some examples to back that claim up.
Oh, there's many examples to back this claim. For example, let me give you one, the orbits. The Quran in chapter 21 verse 33 says, "And it is He who created the night and the day and the sun and the moon, all in an orbit are swimming. And the Arabic word used here is yasbahuna, swimming. Now think about the multi-layered, multi-leveled approach. So take one layer of meaning, which means swimming. It addresses a level of understanding in the 7th century, which was understood just looking at the cosmos with the naked eye. If you have a desert Arab looking to the night sky, seeing the moon move, looking at the sun move, the constellations are changing all the time, and all of these things, he understands that these celestial objects are swimming in the ocean of space. It's not a miracle, but it does its job. It's there to get the 7th century mindset, this particular level of understanding, to reflect on the phenomenon, to conclude that Allah deserves to be worshipped, because who put them there? Who created the physical causes in the universe for that to happen? It must be the divine mind, if you like, right? The all-knowing being, yeah? And therefore he deserves to be worshipped. However, continuing with this multi-layered and multi-leveled approach, even the word yasbahuna can relate to a 21st century understanding. That's not only swimming, but it's orbits,
Sure.
celestial mechanics. Do you see?
Yep.
It still doesn't mean it's a miracle, but it means that it still can address our understanding of the reality.
Right.
And that's the point. It's not supposed to give you how these orbits work and the nature of these orbits and the scientific nuances of these orbits and celestial mechanics, but it points you to that direction so you can reflect, and therefore you can conclude, wow, there's something going on in the universe. Allah deserves to be worshipped. Now, this is why Mustansir Mir, who's a professor of Islamic studies at Youngstown State University, he also makes this point. He advocates this multi-layered, multi-leveled approach. And he says, the word yasbahuna, swim or float, in the verse, and it's the verse that we just mentioned, made good sense to 7th century Arabs observing natural phenomena with the naked eye.
Right.
It is equally meaningful to us in light of today's scientific findings, i.e. celestial mechanics. So he's trying to say, look, there's a word here, has different layers of meaning, and it addresses different levels of understanding. Now, one would argue, but this verse also is talking about the sun having its own orbit. Doesn't that mean that the Quran is wrong because it's referring to the fact, the 7th century primitive understanding that the sun was going around the earth? No. don't read into the Quran. Allow the Quran to speak for itself. Because many people do this. You have atheists and skeptics saying, oh, why would I believe in a book that says that the sun goes around the earth? Hey, you've done that reading, not the Quran.
Yes.
Allow the Quran to speak for itself. Don't have presuppositions. But when we apply this approach to this verse, we see maybe it was addressing the level, so multi-level, the level of understanding with the 7th century Arab, which probably they thought that the sun was going around the earth. But that very fact itself would still instill some kind of awe and evoke an understanding that someone is doing that, and there's a divine wisdom in the universe. But at the same time, it can also mean that the sun has its own orbit and movement, not necessarily around the earth,
Yes.
but it just has its own orbit.
Yep.
And that's actually true from a perspective of another level, which is the 21st century level of understanding.
Right.
Because we now know the sun does have its own orbit. It orbits the Milky Way, and it takes 226 million years to do so.
So just before we move on, there's a contention that can be made here. That is, what you're saying is that the Quranic verses have many layers of meaning,
Yes.
many levels of meaning. So they make sense to someone in the past and in the present and in different contexts too.
Yes.
Someone may say, well, what you're saying...
By the way,
Yes.
I'm only referring to natural phenomena.
Right.
Because if you study the sciences of tafsir, of exegesis, you can't change the meaning.
Yes.
Because if you have hadith, a prophetic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace explaining a verse, you can't go beyond that.
Right.
If you have an ijma'a of the ulama, for example, consensus of the scholars,
Yes.
or of their students, or whatever the case may be, many people know the sciences of tafsir. You can't change meaning.
Yeah.
We are talking about the verses that do not have scholarly consensus, do not have the Prophet Muhammad upon whom peace explaining them per se.
Sure.
That's in where you have to refer to the linguistics, the language, go to pre-Islamic poetry, whatever the case may be, to find out what was the linguistic understanding of this meaning. Because there is a difference between linguistic understanding and Islamic Sharia understanding. And so, but once you exhaust all the other sources, which is the consensus, which is the prophetic traditions, the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace explaining the verse,
Yep.
if you don't have any information from these sources, then you have to rely on the language.
Okay.
So that's what we're talking about.
Okay,
yeah.
but the specific contention I was talking about was, someone may say, well, you're saying that a word or a verse may have multiple meanings,
Yes,
right?
that's true. Yeah.
And they say, well, what you're doing in actual fact, well, the verse may have, and this is a contention, that may
Yes.
have an endless amount of meanings, and whatever happens in reality, you just correlate with the Quran. It's just convenient. for you.
that's not true, because we're going to discuss this at the end as well,
Yes.
because there are some verses which you can't correlate to science at all.
Right.
But it doesn't mean the Quran is wrong.
Right.
It might mean that science will catch up.
Yes.
Or that it's a way of motivating the reader to do more science.
Sure.
But that's not the point. The point here is no one is claiming there's an infinite number
Exactly,
of
yeah.
meanings for a particular word.
Yes, yeah.
There's a scope of meaning.
Yep.
For example, we're going to discuss this now. The word alaqa has like around 5 meanings.
Yep.
It doesn't have 200.
Yeah.
That's 5. Do you
Yeah.
see my point? So it has a scope of meaning.
Right, okay, excellent. Let's carry
So
on.
let's give let's talk about a case study now, right? Let's use the word alaqa. Now, the word alaqa can be found in many places in the Quran, specifically in chapter 23, verse 14, and it's to describe the development of the human being. Many people think this is embryology, right? Now, the word alaqa has 5 major meanings according to many dictionaries like Lane's Lexicon, Lisan al-Arab, and many others. One of the meanings is blood in a general sense. Number 2, a blood clot. Number 3, clay that sticks to the hand or clings to the hand. Number 4, something that clings. Number 5, a leech or a worm. These are established meanings, and we know they're established meanings as well, because even 9th century Greeks who tried to translate the Quran even used the word leech in the Greek language to describe the word alaqa in the Quran. So there was a kind of linguistic environment that these meanings were popping up. Yeah.
Right, okay.
So there's those 5 meanings. Now, let's apply our approach, the multi-layered and multi-leveled approach. It's a big tongue twister, I apologize. So, from the 7th century perspective, we know that many of the Arabs and the people around that peninsula around that time adopted a Greek understanding. That's the best inference we can make, because you had the Greek physician, 2nd century physician Galen. He wrote the works on semen and other works concerning medicine and embryology and the development of the human being, and they were translated in Egypt, and you could find them, I believe, in Alexandria in the 6th century, I believe.
Right.
You even had them in Iraq. And so therefore, surrounding that environment, you had a Galenic or Aristotelian Greek understanding of these things, right? That's the best inference to make, especially when we know that they were traders and they exchanged knowledge, right? So the 7th century Arab most probably thought the embryo to be a blood clot. Now, this is not necessarily wrong from a naked eye perspective when you have natural abortions, which are called miscarriages, especially around day 20 to 40 or something. The embryo looks like a blood clot, basically. It's a fleshy, bloody filled thing, right? Especially day 20 to 25. Now, that's exactly what Galen wrote about, the Greek physician in the 2nd century. He wrote the book on semen, and he used the words sarkoidis, which in Greek means fleshy, and emados, which means bloody. There's another word he used which means filled, but I forgot what word he used. So basically he's describing the embryo at a certain position, certain time, as a fleshy, bloody filled thing, right? It's like a blood clot.
Right. Okay.
And the word alaka means blood in a general sense, or a blood clot.
Yep.
So if the 7th century Arab had that understanding, that layer of meaning is in line with his understanding.
Sure. Yep.
Right? And it's not there to give you details about embryology. It is ridiculous. It's there to evoke awe and say, wow, who created the laws in the universe that enables this bloody mess, this blood clot,
Yep.
this bloody fleshy thing to turn into someone like me?
Yep.
Whoever did that is all-knowing and deserves worship.
Yeah,
Do you
of
see?
course, yeah.
That's the narrative the Quran wants. It doesn't want you to think, here's a scientific textbook, here's all the embryology.
Yeah.
No, because we already know that if you do that, you get yourself in a big mess,
Yeah.
right? So that's the 7th century understanding. And there's lots of pictures that you can see online and offline and in the textbooks that, it looks like a bloody, fleshy filled thing, right? Now, it's also appropriate for our time. So take another layer of its meaning, which is leech or a worm.
Right.
And take the level of understanding that we have now, because we have the microscope. It was developed in the 15th century, discovered in the 15th century, and use it. And you see around day 20 to 25 or day 20 to 30, 22 to 30, you see that the embryo looks like a
blood clot, basically, like a leech.
Like a leech or a worm.
Yeah.
That's why Dr. Dale Lehman describes it as a worm. Even P.Z. Myers, the atheist critic, academic, he even describes it as a worm. Maybe it was a slip of a tongue, but it's one of his old blogs.
So that's what it looks like. If you look
Well,
at
it looks like it. Yeah, it just looks like a leechy thing, a wormy thing. Yeah. Now, what's interesting is when you use the microscope and you look at the embryo at that stage, day 22 to 25 or something, you see it looks like a leech or worm. Not only that, not only the external features, but if you were to dissect a medicinal leech, you see that it still looks like a leech or a worm at that similar stage. So the point here is, maybe it means that. Allah knows, God knows, right? But the point is, we're not saying there's anything miraculous here. We're not saying that. We're just doing tadabbur, reflection. Now, so therefore, what we've shown so far is, if you take the different layers of meaning, they address different levels of understanding.
Right.
7th century and a 21st century. What I like to do, though, is not only focus on an empirical biological paradigm. I like to focus on a spiritual paradigm.
Sure.
Because there's another aspect to looking at these verses. It's not even to look at it from a scientific perspective. It's to look at it from a timeless, non-scientific perspective, a spiritual perspective. Because maybe Allah is describing us as literally just like leeches, that we were parasites in our mother's womb. Because what a leech does, you put a leech in your hand, it will just suck the blood, it will just drain your resources, and it will just roll off and it's had a nice day, right? It's taken what it needs and it's drained your blood. It's a parasite. The embryo is no different. Fine, it doesn't suck the maternal blood, but it does raid her blood in order to get what it wants. Sure. That's why mothers have to eat, not only for the baby, but for themselves to keep healthy, because the baby is going to take what it wants. There's this parasitic relationship. So from a spiritual perspective, an emotional perspective, it's going to make us realize, hey, you were like a parasite. Lower the wing of humility to your mother. Be more compassionate. If it wasn't for her, you won't be here. You're a dependent. You're not self-sufficient. And also, she willingly and willfully gave herself her resources so you could be born. Because she could have stopped. She could have said, right, I don't want this baby anymore. Or she could have said, God knows what she could have done. The point is, she willingly and willfully allowed her body to be used by you in a parasitical way. Because you drained her resources. This should make you feel, oh my God, I should love my mother more, I should respect her more, and I'm not self-sufficient, I'm dependent on my mother, and therefore ultimately dependent on God.
But yeah, wow.
Do you see? That's
Very
a more of a
powerful.
spiritual insight. You know what's very interesting? Professor of Science Lord Robert Wilson, he's an emeritus professor of fertility studies at Imperial College, in a documentary, and we'll give you the link for you to see this. Look what he said, or hear what he said. He said, the leech takes whatever it needs to live by sucking the blood of whatever it can latch onto. In that case, that's me. He had a leech on his hand. As it sucks my blood, it takes from it all that it needs to live. It literally lives off me, and the whole of pregnancy is shaped by a similar kind of parasitic relationship. Unlike the leech, the developing embryo doesn't suck the maternal blood, but it does raid her blood for the raw materials it needs to grow. From the word go, both leech and embryo are out for themselves.
Oh.
So from this perspective, you can see there's many layers of meaning, and it addresses different levels of understanding.
Sure.
A non-scientific understanding, a 21st century understanding, and a 7th century understanding. So not supposed to give you details. It's supposed to point you to those directions. The book of signs. It's supposed to say to you, look at that sign. Conclude whatever you want about that sign concerning its scientific details.
Yeah.
But what's weaving itself through that understanding is the ultimate conclusion that there's wisdom in the universe and that God deserves to be worshipped. Because the point is, God wants to speak to the 7th century man, the 50th century man, and the 21st century man. Not just us, right? So from this perspective, this is a new approach. It doesn't claim miracle, but it's profound because it gets people to do tadabbur, to ponder upon the Quran. The Quran says, do they not ponder upon this Quran, or the locks on their hearts?
Yeah.
Which in a way can mean that the more pondering you do, the more your heart becomes unlocked to receive His guidance and mercy. Now, there is a final contention because, as we just mentioned, that they may say there's no science for some of the verses. Some of the verses that it mentions cannot be justified scientifically at all. So what do we say to this? Well, it's very simple. No one is claiming that every single verse relating to natural phenomena must be scientifically understood. Maybe it has a non-scientific meaning, like a spiritual meaning.
Like we've seen in the previous example.
Or it could be relating to a scientific understanding that we don't know of yet, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be a perspective that we haven't understood yet. The point is, maybe science will catch up. Why do you think that science and revelation always have to agree with each other? If that's the case, then the 19th century Muslim would have a huge problem.
Yeah.
Because in the 19th century, they believe that the universe never began, but the Quran says the universe began. So what do you do?
Yeah.
So from this perspective, yes, there can be many cases where science contradicts the Quran. And the point here is, big deal.
Yeah.
That's
I think
it. Science is going to change.
Yeah, some of it
Maybe our understanding of the Quran is not good enough. You know, these things are grey in many instances. I mean, if you look even at the classical exegetical works, even the scholars disagreed on certain realities. This is the beauty of the Quran. Just ponder. Yes, there could be a contradiction. Big deal.
Yeah.
We know science changes. So we haven't got the full scientific conclusion yet. Even if we believe it's 99% true, there could be paradigm shifts. We know this in the history of science. And also the Quran, how do you know that is the meaning of the Quran? How do you know you're doing the right, and how do you know you have the right understanding of the Quran? It could be talking about something that's non-empirical.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, it may even talk about something that seems to be empirical, but maybe it has a spiritual meaning.
Sure.
We don't know. The
Right.
point here is, though, that's the beauty of the Quran. Is supposed to get you to think and to ponder further. And that's why the Quran was understood by the early Muslims, and it encouraged them to do more science. Like Ibn al-Haytham, who's known to be the first scientist, according to David C. Lindbergh, a historian of science, he wrote the book on optics. And in his autobiography, if you like, he said, I wrote the book of optics, which was the first manifestation of the formal scientific method. I wrote this because I was encouraged by the Quran. The Quran pointed me to these realities. Didn't give him details,
Yep.
but it pointed him. Just look how God makes things work, right?
Yeah.
And it encourages him to do more science. So Muslims should love science, should do more science, shouldn't have a problem if science contradicts the Quran. That's not a
Yes.
problem either, because we know science can change.
Yep.
And it encourages us to see the Quran in a different way. And you know, the Quran is primarily a book that is there for us to conclude that God deserves to be worshipped. Not
Sure.
that there's any details in this in these sciences, or the details in these verses rather. So I don't know. Any other questions, bro?
I think you covered it really well. We have gone over time.
I mean, there is more questions, and we will address them in the
Yeah, of course,
future
and
because
there's the essay we're gonna link
yeah,
into
you
the
can't
video as well.
address this very detailed subject in just 2 shows,
Sure.
but it's food for thought. And my encouragement to the Muslims and to the non-Muslims, especially to the Muslims, is to, challenge the existing narrative at the moment, because I do feel that it's quite dangerous. And yes, I myself was responsible for it too, but we need to change, we need to be sincere, and we need to basically have more robust narratives.
Yes.
And that's why we should challenge as many people as possible in a positive way, with good adab, with good etiquette and akhlaq and respect and love and compassion, so we could have a more robust narrative that allows the Quran to speak for itself.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly summed up. Like you said, there's a lot more to it, but I think it gives people a taste of what's going on.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to conclude, the last 30 seconds, what would you say, how can people take this information and now popularize it, get it out to others so they can actually start using this and not make the mistakes that were made in the past, basically?
Well, firstly, what they can do is understand this new approach further, read the essay that we've provided, listen to this show again, speak to their scholars, speak to people who know, and maybe podcast, write their own essays, do their own videos, challenge the people who are articulating the so-called scientific miracles claim, because I think it misrepresents the Quran and it also misrepresents science. And once they challenge that, and yes, don't be rude, be nice, be polite, and I believe that we would allow the Quran to speak for itself, and we'll revive the spiritual nature of the Quran, which was the main reason for the Quran, to make us realize that God deserves to be worshipped. Well, there's some kind of scientific details in this book. There isn't. The Quran is there to make you think about reality, to conclude that He deserves to be worshipped, and that's the focus. But what we've done, we've shifted it away to, hey, have you seen this word? It's so amazing. Look at this. It's fantastic. And their faith hangs on this thin thread on science. You can't do that, because the beauty of science is that thread is supposed to break all the time, because it's supposed to change. That's the beauty of science. That's why we discover new things. That's why we have new approaches. That's why we have new theories. That's why we have new conclusions, because we do more science, more observation, we get more data, and we have different conclusions. So the point is, you can't see the Quran that way. It's a very dangerous way of basing your entire faith, and not that it's inconsistent, it's not robust, and it's incoherent. And I think it is probably one of the main reasons for a lot of people actually leaving Islam, because they haven't understood the Quran properly, because we've given them the wrong type of understanding. We've given them the wrong lenses to understand the Quran.
Right. But I think it's time to change that now, inshallah.
We have to change it. We have to change it. And I mean, I was doing webinars on this I've been doing webinars and seminars on this for the past few years. I think 3 years now, 2.5 years, and it's hard. It's hard to change it. The reason we want to do these shows is for people to adopt this further, and for us to basically move forward as a community and be more robust.
Yes.
But it's a lonely space at the moment. I think there are a lot of people who agree with us, but we need more voices. We need more loudspeakers to adopt this. I sent my essay to Sheikh Akram Nadwi. He said it should be translated into the main Muslim languages.
Wow.
He loved it. He sent it to his students. I sent it to Ustad Norman Ali Khan. He sent it to his students and his people. Norman Ali Khan, I believe, adopts this approach now. Abdurrahim Green adopts this approach now. So there's a slowly but surely changing narrative. And if you want to summarize the whole narrative, Allah is Al-Hakim. He is the wise. He has the picture. We just have the pixel. Whatever we know, we're going to catch up to the divine knowledge.
Inshallah. So hopefully this has been beneficial. Jazakallah khair, Brother Hamza, for coming on and doing this. And inshallah, stay tuned, share the video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.